We're here today with Mr. Timothy Karr, Senior Director of Strategy at Free Press. Mr. Karr, in addition to his position at Free Press, has extensive experience as a reporter, editor, and blogger, and has served as Executive Director of MediaChannel.org and Vice President of Global Vision New Media. Thank you for being here with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Just a couple questions, again, on your presentation today.
Sure.
So net neutrality for many people is a really technical concept.
Yeah.
Many of the people who are working as who are helping you out in the cause as activists may not, before they join the cause, fully understand all of the issues that are entangled with net neutrality. So for Free Press succeeding in mobilizing hundreds of thousands of internet users to fight for regulatory action, how did that come about, in your opinion?
Well, as I mentioned during my presentation, it's taken us more than 10 years. And that's been 10 years involved in a whole realm of organizing and communications tactics and building that base. I mean, that when net neutrality in 2015 went before the FCC, we had 4 million people make comments, and some of those comments were actually quite intelligent. But when we started this issue in 2005 and 2006, there was a great public education effort. But the beauty about net neutrality, and it admittedly is a very complicated, or I wouldn't even say it's complicated, it's a term that tends to make your eyes gloss over. And we experienced a lot of that in the early going. But when people got it, they really got it. Because everybody uses the internet, and they understand inherently. If you're an internet user, you understand inherently what it's about. It's about your ability to go on a network and choose where you go, whom you communicate with, what you prefer, without having, like you might experience with cable television or radio stations, having to deal with an intermediary, having to deal with a channel, having to deal with a cable company that is telling you what you can do and where you can go. Net neutrality preserves that open concept that really makes the internet users in charge of their media experience. And that's unheard of in the history of communications. The way the network was designed is it puts that power of choice at the edges with we, the internet users, and it takes away the center, which is the gatekeeper, which in traditional media, look at the history of radio, you look at the history of television, you look at the history of newspapers, cable television, there's always been an editor or a producer or a channel that controls the center of that network. And the inherent design that's baked into the DNA of the internet is this centerless, decentralized network that is controlled at its edges. And essentially that's what we're trying to preserve by protecting net neutrality.
Right. So that to the casual observer, that sounds a lot like the first, sort of First Amendment rights that as Americans we hold very, very dearly.
Sure.
How does the First Amendment sort of play into this? First Amendment rights and freedom of expression play into this debate?
Well, I mean, the net neutrality has made the First Amendment a living document for internet users, but the significant difference there is the First Amendment was written to prevent, to restrict governments from censoring speech. The threat in a wired world is not so much from government, so that does exist. It's a very real threat if you're looking at countries like China, you're looking at countries like Egypt or Turkey. There's a really big threat of internet censorship that comes from government, but there's an additional threat that's particularly sensitive to in the United States, and that is from internet access providers that are very consolidated, that have control over access, but not just that, they also have interests in content properties. If you look at the largest internet access provider in the United States, Comcast also owns NBC Universal, which is a television studio, many channels, it makes movies, it does all sorts of things, and there's a built-in conflict of interest. If you combine content with the means of delivery into one corporation, that corporation's tendency will be to favor its own content, and net neutrality prevents that from happening. And so it becomes the challenge. The free speech challenge there is the First Amendment doesn't apply to private entities. How do you create a legal structure that protects free speech over private networks? And since hundreds of millions of people are now communicating via private networks, it becomes a very real issue. And we've also seen the rise of private platforms, social networks like Facebook. And there's another issue there. How do you protect free speech over Facebook, when tens of millions, they claim 1.6 billion users are communicating via this privately held network. So these are the kind of challenges that we've been dealing with in the last 10 years, and with the rise of Facebook and the rise of Google, the challenge for the next 10 years is pretty clear. It's like, how do you protect free speech in these private communications worlds where we come to expect that we should have this First Amendment right to communicate. But if you actually look at the terms and conditions, which nobody ever looks at when they sign on to these networks, that expectation is false. So you have to create new legal structures to force these networks to protect free speech.
Certainly. So you mentioned in the presentation that internet users actually are starting to represent a growing political constituency, which is something we haven't really seen or experienced before as a nation. What do you see as the role of this group? Sort of, who makes up this group, this political constituency? Is it
Sure.
Mostly youth?
It's increasingly diverse. It really is anyone who uses the internet,
right.
and even people who may be on the wrong side of the digital divide, who want to get access to the internet. They've become increasingly involved in a range of internet policy issues. It's kind of unusual when you think about it that people care about policy. Internet policy is about as arcane and difficult to understand as it gets when it comes to policy making in Washington. But they're increasingly on the issue of net neutrality. Millions of people have taken action on the issue of copyright. And there have been tens of millions of people who've taken action to kill the PIPA and SOPA legislation that was introduced about 4 years ago. They have come to identify themselves as people who are willing to engage politically on a range of internet issues related to free speech, to choice in the market, to universal access, to protecting privacy. There's been a lot of organizing in the wake of the Edward Snowden's revelations in 2013 to try to protect our use of the internet from prying eyes at the NSA and at the FBI and elsewhere. So the organizations that are mostly civil society groups, not-for-profit organizations like Free Press, EFF, ACLU, there are dozens of others, have been communicating. We have been working together on a range of issues because we know as a coalition that has very diverse constituencies, our ability to win on these policy debates that happened in Washington are often predicated on our ability to educate and engage with millions of people who are willing to pick up their phone, call their member of Congress, they're willing to write a letter to the FCC, they're willing to come out in the streets in some instance in protest in front of an Apple store or on Capitol Hill.
Right. Thank you. So my final question, we heard earlier the presentation of Dr. Susan Crawford, who talked about the idea of using municipal broadband as a solution to some of these issues. What do you see going forward, either with that solution or any other as the next step for supporters of net neutrality?
I think that municipal broadband speaks to the issue. It speaks to a couple of issues. It speaks to one of choice. In the United States, there's a lack of choice in the marketplace. Susan cited a statistic that the FCC often uses. It said 75% of internet users, broadband internet users, have only one or fewer choices. And fewer would be the non-internet users, just to be clear. So you have a lack of competition. We're looking to new solutions in the marketplace. So beyond your cable provider or your phone company, do communities have a role? And many communities have said yes, they do. They oftentimes use existing infrastructure. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, it's a very good example of the municipality using the power grid, which had already laid infrastructure for fiber when they laid the initial infrastructure for electricity, and using that existing infrastructure to light up their city. So municipalities are increasingly getting involved. Google has a fiber program that's rolled out in a couple of cities. So they're sort of chipping around at the edges. I mean, if you look at it today, municipal broadband, the Google alternative, only make up a very small percentage of overall internet access availability. So it's still a problem, but we have to be able to allow communities to build their own broadband solution. There have been efforts to prevent that at the state level with laws that the phone and cable lobby has passed that prevent municipal broadband. So we have to fight those kinds of initiatives and make sure that as many choices that are available can be built without those types of restrictions.